Reverend Michelle Scott-Huffman. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the minister here at First UU. Before I begin my message today, I would like to start with a content note. The message references oppression of marginalized groups and recounts a particularly violent racist act that occurred locally. So let's take a breath together. James Baldwin wrote, "Imagination creates the situation, and then the situation creates imagination. It may, of course, be the other way around. Columbus was discovered by what he found." This past Monday was Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and here in Springfield, it played out a little differently than past MLK Day celebrations. I'm fairly new to Springfield, having started my work with the campus ministry here on MLK Day in 2018. Needless to say, with it being my first day on the job and in Springfield, I didn't participate in the march that day. But the MLK Day march in 2019 and 2020 were deeply meaningful and moving experiences for me, and an important event for the students in our campus ministry as well. So while I was a little sad that COVID-19 had messed up yet another great community event, I was also happy to set out on the more intimate experience of traveling the Springfield African American Heritage Trail in small groups, as suggested by the Springfield NAACP, and sharing photos and reflections on social media. If you haven't seen them, they can be found by searching #MovingForwardMLK. Our group was a caravan of 10 cars that looped around from Pitts Chapel United Methodist Church to the old Lincoln School, to Timmons Hall and Silver Springs Park, Washington Avenue Baptist Church, which is now the Diversity Center at Drury University, and finally to the site of the 1906 lynching at Park Central Square. I've heard the story of the lynchings on the square just barely over a century ago, but there's something altogether different about standing in the place where it happened and trying to have a conversation about it, trying to make sense of it, trying to imagine what people were thinking, white people, church people, who participated in a lynch mob or maybe just stood by and watched as the mob broke into the jail and took Duncan and Coker to the city square where they were hanged from the Gottfried Tower, an iron structure topped with a replica of the Statue of Liberty. Not satisfied with lynching the two men, the mob returned to the jail and brought Allen to be lynched. By Easter Sunday morning, all that remained was a pile of ashes and the men's burned bodies. A crowd of thousands had watched this horror. And then they went home, went to bed, got up the next morning and went to church in their Sunday best. Who knows, maybe the events of the day before were the topic of conversation at Easter Sunday dinners all around town. Maybe some folks never spoke of it again. But fearing further violence, many African Americans left the city, some never to return, changing the makeup of Springfield's citizenry from about 20% African American to something more like 4 to 4.5%. After the lynching, a grand jury indicted 18 men who were involved in the incident. One man was brought to trial. No one was ever convicted. Today, I say their names: Horace Duncan, Fred Coker, and William Allen. If it had happened today, their names would have become hashtags, like so many have since Michael Brown on August 9th, 2014, and I shudder to think of how many there were in between. We'd like to think it couldn't happen today, except that just a few weeks ago, we saw a noose hanging from makeshift gallows directly across from our US Capitol building. And suddenly we don't have to work so hard to imagine the vitriol of that mob in Springfield in 1906. White supremacy is alive and well in this nation, in our state, and even in our city. Imagination creates the situation, and the situation creates imagination. And it can be a dangerous cycle that spins out of control until otherwise reasonable people are engaged in unimaginable acts. Or imagination can be a force for disruption that halts the chaos long enough for folks to imagine something different. When we were on the African American Heritage Trail reading those historical markers and talking about what happened in those places, I heard so many people say, I didn't know. There is so much that we don't know because we don't have to know. It's not our history. It's unpleasant. It's so far removed from what seems possible to us that we just can't go there in our minds. Pastor Christy Love of the Connecting Grounds posted after her MLK Day walk, we must work to understand the truth of the past in order to challenge the problems of the present and positively influence the path to the future. In order for us to achieve justice and equity for all people in this world, we must first be able to imagine it. And before we can imagine what justice and equity look like, we have to get honest about what injustice and inequity have looked like for so many people for so long, including in spaces that we like to think of as liberal or progressive. In an On Being podcast called Fortifying Imagination, Jason Reynolds said, history is birthed out of the imagination. It literally was conjured up. Imagination is so powerful that it could set forth 400, 500 years of something wrong, which means that it very well could set forth 400, 500 years of something right. That's sort of the beauty of humanity. Jason Reynolds believes that we have both the imagination and the fortitude to conjure up something different. For the hope is not to make America great again, rather it is to make America something it's never been before. If we honor the experience of everyone, we can't look back to better days with nostalgia. We have to imagine something we've never seen before. And for those of us who have led fairly comfortable lives without much challenge to our existence, it's hard to imagine something different. But you know who can imagine something different? The people who have lived the painful reality of what has been, and who know that their humanity, their dignity, their sacred existence calls us to something higher, something better. And if we will only listen, we can hear beautiful, vivid descriptions of what is possible, and I might argue, what is necessary. I've been reading the work of Adrienne Maree Brown, who tweeted yesterday, someday maybe I'll be able to tell the story of this past week. Maybe not, such weeks happen. But when I tell you only love and Bernie memes got me through, it's no exaggeration. The abundance of both reminds me of how generative humans can be and how we survive the impossible. Brown believes that in the power of the human imagination and holds that all organizing is science fiction. She writes that we are bending the future together into something we have never experienced, a world where everyone experiences abundance, access, pleasure, human rights, dignity, freedom, transformative justice, peace. We long for this. We believe it's possible. Inspired by the work of Walida Amarisha, writer of visionary fiction, Brown resonates with the idea that all of writing is either advancing or regressing justice. What if it's not just true that all writing is either advancing or regressing justice, but that all speech is either advancing or regressing justice? That all of our actions are either advancing or regressing justice. All of our committee work, our economic choices, our governance, our social interactions are either advancing or regressing justice. What if there truly is no neutral ground? What then are we called to in this moment? Can you imagine it? Can you imagine a season in which our commitment to the values and principles that guide us lead us to concrete actions that advance justice and equity? Can you imagine a multi-generational, diverse community of liberal and liberating faith really committing to one another and to the hard work of inclusion, healing, and reconciliation, knowing that it means there is so much to be learned and unlearned. Can you imagine cultivating a congregational culture in which every person's voice and experience is heard and held up as valuable and important? A culture where someone sharing that they've been hurt or felt unwelcome leads not to division and defensiveness, but to leaning in together and learning about the offense, taking responsibility and committing to a change of attitudes, behaviors, and policies that lead to greater inclusion, wider welcome, and deeper relationships. Can you imagine the ways that a deep commitment to justice and equity in our personal lives and in our common congregational life can begin to make a difference in the community around us? I have allowed myself to imagine it, and it's beautiful, and I hope you will too. This past Thursday, we saw a national prayer service that wasn't a simple call to unity without accountability. It wasn't a celebration of militarism, co-opting theological language of sovereignty and blessing as we've seen in the past. It was a national prayer service beyond the imagination of many who have watched or been a part of those services in the past. NPR reports, gone were the conservative evangelical leaders who had been invited in the past. No Catholic bishops or priests took part. This year's national prayer service, a long-standing inauguration tradition to welcome an incoming presidential administration, instead featured two transgender faith leaders, the president of the Navajo Nation, and a host of speakers with urgent calls for national transformation. Since 2014, I have hosted and been in dozens of audiences where Reverend Dr. William Barber, the founder of the Moral Monday movement in North Carolina, spoke passionately about a third Reconstruction in the United States. In most of those spaces, Barber was preaching to the choir, as they say. But Thursday, he was preaching to the nation, and probably the world, about the interlocking injustices of systemic racism, poverty, ecological devastation, denial of healthcare, the war economy, and a false, distorted moral narrative of religious nationalism. 7 years ago, I would not have imagined Dr. Barber on that stage, sharing that message with that audience, but I think maybe he did, and that's important. For those of us who haven't struggled with the effects of racism, homophobia, transphobia, poverty, the stigma of mental health struggles, and a whole host of other injustices, we can't imagine the steps that we have to take to make justice and equity a reality. But you know who can? The people who have experienced the pain, the oppression, and the marginalization, and those are the voices we have to center in the conversation. Those are the minds and hearts that have envisioned and ached for change. Those are the leaders for such a time as this. And our work is to pay attention, to listen, to learn, to follow, and to expand our imagination of what is possible. This is a threshold moment. Let us boldly and humbly step through and allow ourselves, our church, our community, and our nation to be transformed. Let us imagine that justice and equity are not just possible, but inevitable. Because Unitarian Theodore Parker and later Martin Luther King Jr. said the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. So let us imagine and live into that reality with each new day. I close with these words from Thomas More in The Reenchantment of Everyday Life. We tend to consider imagination too lightly, forgetting that the life we make for ourselves individually and for the world as a whole is shaped and limited only by the powers of our imagination. Things are as we imagine them to be, as we imagine them into existence. May it be so. Blessed be